This is America, and right now the Western Pacific will temporarily not have a single U.S. aircraft carrier in it. The USS George Washington is leaving to relieve the Abraham Lincoln in the Middle East. It's not uncommon, but it raises questions about how the U.S. can sustain a formidable presence in both regions. First, though, let's go to our D.C. studio and Alex Marquardt.
Thank you, Manny. Where an aircraft carrier goes is often a strong indication of where Washington's attention is. Right now, that attention is pulling away from the Pacific and towards the Middle East. The U.S. Navy is replacing one carrier there with another, which had been deployed to Asia, while the campaign against Iran drags on. And of course, China is watching closely in a region that hosts dozens of U.S. defense sites and produces the chips that much of the world's economy depends on. Our Manny Rapolo has this report from the naval port city of Norfolk, Virginia.
They're among the most visible symbols of American military power, aircraft carriers, and the United States has 11 of them. But the conflict with Iran is demonstrating that even the world's largest carrier fleet has its limits. 3 American carriers are currently deployed, with the USS George H.W. Bush and the USS George Washington now in the Middle East. The Washington was sent there from the Western Pacific to relieve the USS Abraham Lincoln after more than a 250-day deployment, one of the longest continuous periods at sea for a U.S. carrier in modern history.
The Lincoln has been out there for a period of time, good period of time. But over the years, we've had them out there much longer.
The extended deployment has brought reports of supply problems and sparked concerns from some families and lawmakers about the mental health and well-being of its roughly 5,000 sailors and Marines.
It's not too much to ask to have a clear mission, to be treated in decent conditions in the meantime, and just to have an administration that tells the truth.
The Trump administration has pushed back against reports of deteriorating conditions aboard the Lincoln, while acknowledging the strain of extended operations. But replacing the Lincoln has created another problem. The USS George Washington normally operates from Japan. Sending it thousands of kilometers west to the Middle East has temporarily left the Western Pacific without a single U.S. carrier. Carrier gaps in the Pacific have happened before, yet this move comes as the U.S. fights a prolonged Middle East war, while simultaneously confronting China as its primary long-term strategic rival. The question is whether a fleet of 11 carriers is large enough to do both indefinitely. And there is another constraint. Aircraft carriers can't simply remain at sea indefinitely. After long deployments, they require maintenance and repairs at ports like this one here in Norfolk. That means extending one deployment today could affect what ships are available months or even years later. For decades, the aircraft carrier has allowed the U.S. to project American power almost anywhere on Earth. The war with Iran is now testing how many places it can do that at the same time. Manuel Rapalo, Al Jazeera, Norfolk, Virginia.
And here to discuss why the United States is repositioning some of its most significant military assets, we have retired Vice Admiral John Miller. He was the head of U.S. naval forces in the Middle East, and Gregory Poling, who is the director of the Southeast Asia program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Admiral, Greg, thank you both for being with us today. I think a lot of people, Admiral, would be surprised to hear that this most formidable military in the world can be stretched thin like this. I want to show our viewers what the aircraft carrier fleet looks like. The U.S. has 11 nuclear-powered aircraft carriers. 8 are in port here in the United States, 5 in Virginia on the East Coast, 3 on the West Coast. And then at sea, we have the USS George H.W. Bush and USS George Washington. They're in the Middle East, while the Abraham Lincoln has finally been relieved and is heading home. And for context, China has just 3 aircraft carriers. So, Admiral, why isn't there enough capacity with these 11 carriers for us to be able to have ships in both the Indo-Pacific and the Middle East at the same time?
Well, we don't have quite enough Navy for all of the requirements that we have. So if you look at that, 11 sounds like a lot. On any given day, there are 10 of those that are available because one is in refueling. We refuel those ships every 25 years, but if you take them in the aggregate, you have one out of service really for about 3 or 4 years. So there's 10, and then ships have to be maintained, the crews have to be trained, and then they go out and deploy. So you sort of divide it by 3. And if you said we had 9 carriers available on any given day, 3 can be deployed, 3 just got back, and 3 are getting ready to go again. So if you surge to a place like we've done now, you're taking assets, because we position them globally, you're taking those assets away from one place to put them in another place where you have a concentration of forces. 2 carrier strike groups in the Middle East is a significant amount of firepower, and so that comes at a cost someplace else.
Do you think something needs to be done to diversify to make up for this reliance on aircraft carriers themselves?
Well, the Navy's doing that through a new strategy called the hedging strategy, which talks about, because since World War II, we have really organized all of our seagoing units around aircraft carriers. So you take a carrier and all the associated warships, the destroyers, the cruisers, the frigates.
A so-called carrier strike group.
A carrier strike group, and that all goes together. And if it's a big fire, that all goes together. If it's a little fire, it all goes together. So what we're looking at now is, can we take places like the Caribbean, for example, doesn't really require an aircraft carrier. So can we take a few smaller ships, some destroyers, put them into that mission and not have to deploy the entire carrier strike group? That gives us a little more flexibility with our maintenance as well as our operational deployments.
We've heard a lot about the USS Abraham Lincoln. It is on its way home. Greg, what does it tell us about how the war in Iran is going, that the U.S. needs to pull a strike group from Asia and swap it out with the Lincoln?
I mean, the message seems self-evident, right? If there was an obvious way out of this, the administration would have already found it. The early narrative was always that this was not going to pull resources away from what the administration's own strategies say are the top priority theaters, which are the Western Hemisphere and Asia. Well, it's pulled assets away from both of those. And I think that the carrier has caught so much attention because it's such a big symbolic move, but it follows on months and months of redistribution of assets, aircraft, Marines from Japan. We're pulling all kinds of stuff out of Asia, even though the administration insists that we remain committed to that as the priority challenge.
Let's talk about the USS Abraham Lincoln, because it has gotten a lot of headlines. It has been extended. We've heard a lot about the conditions on board. And Admiral, we've heard all these reports about multiple sailors trying to jump overboard. What was your reaction when you heard these reports?
Well, those reports aren't verified. And I think actually talking to Admiral Cooper, listening to him, there's a different story there. One sailor did fall off the ship. That happens from time to time on aircraft carriers and was quickly rescued. But let's not forget, we asked the Lincoln crew to do an extraordinary thing. They were at sea for a very, very long time. So when you see an aircraft carrier, it seems like a huge ship. Spend 250 days on it, it gets very small. And you're always at work. There's really no day off at sea. So we ought to be really proud of how well the crew performed, how well the ship performed, all the aspects of its mission in combat. Great support from their families back home, but a very, very difficult task, and a task well done, I think.
How difficult can the conditions get on board in both a regular but then an extended deployment for those sailors?
Well, if you never leave the factory, and an aircraft carrier is just a gigantic factory that launches and recovers airplanes and maintains them in between. If you never leave that factory, you never really get a chance to rest and recoup. You can have a day off where you're not required to go to work, you're not required to stand and watch, but you're still at the factory. And so that weighs on people over time. Now, we have a lot of things in place to try to help with crew comfort, entertainment, connections back home, extraordinarily important. We have chaplains and religious services and counselors and psychologists. All those things are available to the sailors. Doesn't make it any easier, and different people are going to respond differently, but it takes a crew with a lot of spine to be able to do what they did.
No doubt a lot of relief for those sailors when they step ashore, when they're back here in the United States. Let's drill down into the geopolitical consequences of pulling the Washington out of the Indo-Pacific. Big consequences for Asia, and I want to zero in on the Asia-Pacific region and why it's so important for America's security and the global economy. Al Jazeera's Tanya Nouri reports.
The Indo-Pacific is central to American power. The U.S. military's Pacific Command, located in the region, spans more than half the planet, encompassing China, North Korea, and some of the busiest sea lanes in the world. Those waters are vital to the global economy, carrying a huge share of international trade, while 9 of the 10 largest ports on Earth are here. And Taiwan, an island roughly the size of Maryland, produces more than 60% of the world's semiconductors and over 90% of the world's most advanced chips. For Washington, that means what happens here can have a direct impact on the American economy. Yet this month, the United States temporarily pulled its last aircraft carrier from the region. The USS George Washington left the South China Sea to relieve the USS Abraham Lincoln for operations in the Middle East amid the war with Iran. The White House tells Al Jazeera that America maintains the force posture necessary to achieve any desired objective set by the commander-in-chief. Navy officials further emphasized to Al Jazeera that its footprint in the region includes roughly 400,000 military and civilian personnel and some 200 ships, and that the Navy is designed to flex across multiple theaters simultaneously, calling it a strategic advantage, not a vulnerability. But pressure is building across the Indo-Pacific. China is expanding its military capabilities around Taiwan as its leader, President Xi Jinping, seeks to claim the island. Any confrontation is expected to pull the United States directly into the crossfire. Then there is North Korea.
He has 57 very powerful nuclear weapons. Should have never allowed it to happen.
Its growing missile and nuclear arsenal continue to challenge U.S. allies South Korea and Japan, with 3 ballistic missile launches tracked just this month alone. While U.S. carriers remain elsewhere for now, the stakes in the Indo-Pacific region remain high. Tanya Nori, Al Jazeera, Washington.
So again, it's the USS George Washington that is being pulled out of Asia and sent to the Middle East. Greg, what does it tell us that the Washington is leaving when it comes to this administration's priority on the Indo-Pacific and the various issues that are at stake there?
Right. So normally we have 2 carriers in the Pacific. This was already down to what some viewed as like a skeleton crew, you know. Now you've got none for at least a while. I think that could have been explained away if it didn't come on the back of months and months of redeployment of other assets. You had just today cancellation of big annual Marine exercises with South Korea because there aren't enough Marines in the theater. They've been pulled out of Japan. You had the scaling back of our biggest annual bilateral exercise with the Koreans last week. Terminal high altitude aerial defense, which is this very sophisticated, the THAAD deployment, that the South Korean government got punished severely by China for years for accepting from the U.S. And then we just yank it out over the objections of the South Korean leadership. All of this stuff sends a message to Asian allies and partners that whatever we might write in the national security strategy and say in speeches, it doesn't look like the U.S. is actually prioritizing the assets and the platforms that you would need to deter aggression from China or from North Korea.
And in terms of speeches, we just saw the person who heads up the Pentagon's policy shop, Elbridge Colby. He was out in Asia. He gave a speech in Manila, the capital of the Philippines. From what I saw, he made no reference to the South China Sea or the U.S. commitment to the Philippines. Is that surprising?
That's utterly shocking. I mean, just 2 weeks ago, Secretary of State Rubio was out in Manila, said all the right things about our alliance commitment. When Secretary Hegseth made his first big speech in Asia, in Manila last year, he said all the right things about the South China Sea and the defense commitment to what is the oldest U.S. ally in the Pacific. The Philippines faces only one national security threat, and it's this threat from China in the maritime domain in the South China Sea. And so to go to Manila and make an entire speech that doesn't involve the word China, much less South China Sea, and makes no reference to the treaty commitment to the Philippines was pretty jarring for Filipinos. And I would be willing to bet it was the first time an official from the U.S. at that level has done something like that, not talked about the South China Sea in probably the last 15 years when they visit the Philippines.
This is not the first time that we haven't had a carrier group in the South China Sea or in the Pacific, rather. What do you think, Admiral, we could see now that we've seen in the past the last time this happened?
Well, if you go back to 2003, it's a little bit further back, but during the Iraqi Freedom Operation, we at one point had 7 carriers that were involved in the Middle East and a number of large deck amphibious ships, 4, I think, at the time. So we had a huge amount of firepower concentrated in the Middle East, meaning it wasn't someplace else. We have ways to cover this with other assets. The chairman's job is to do risk assessment for the president and to let him know if we do this, we move this carrier strike group from the Western Pacific to the Middle East. Here's the risk that we take. Here are the things that we're doing to mitigate the risk. Additional Air Force units, Army units, that sort of thing. You can always bring a carrier from the West Coast of the United States. There are two operating in the Eastern Pacific on workups right now. They're not supposed to be ready to deploy, but you can deploy them early. So in a crisis, we can respond to that. But to Greg's point, in the day-to-day, it's always a little bit difficult when you take assets out of one theater and move them to the next. Sure, that's what naval assets are best at. We're a global force. We can go anywhere in the world. You saw that with the Ford deployment that deployed from the Caribbean to the Mediterranean, to the Indian Ocean, to the Arabian Gulf, all really around the world in a less than a year's time. So we can do that, but being able to stay at home and make sure that you place some priority on a place like the Western Pacific is valuable.
Why does this carry so much weight? I mean, obviously the pictures of these ships sailing are very impressive, but is it because of all of the other assets that come along with the strike group and what those groups can actually carry out militarily?
Yeah, there's a lot of things in a carrier strike group besides just the aircraft carrier, although that in and of itself is impressive. The air wing, when the Ford showed up in the Caribbean, the Ford and an amphibious readiness group, a large deck amphib, the air power that they made up was bigger than the entire Venezuelan Air Force. So they show up with some force. In addition to that, there's intelligence, there's an ability to do long-range strikes. So with our destroyers, you can be 1,000 miles away from a target and project power inland, just about anywhere in the world you can reach with the Tomahawk land attack missiles. So there's a lot of different things that a carrier strike group brings to any region of the world, all of which is intended to increase the stability. So that's where we normally put them, where there is instability. And I think what we see here with the president is the desire to have enough firepower in the region should the conflict with Iran turn hotter again.
Greg, do you expect to see China act any differently?
Not in the short term. We still expect President Xi to likely come to Washington next month. I think China is still prioritizing some stability in this bilateral relationship. It's been very unpredictable for them and quite damaging to their interests. That said, Beijing is, I think, happy, not necessarily with the closure of the Strait of Hormuz. I think that hurts China, but it is happy to see the diminishment of U.S. credibility among allies and partners. I mean, China's biggest gripe has always been this alliance network, South Korea, Japan, the Philippines, and Australia, along with our partners in the region that hem in Beijing and really make the U.S. a Pacific power. Right? Without those allies, we are not a Pacific power. And so to see these doubts seeded for months now about not just U.S. commitment, but U.S. capability. Do we even have the munitions we would need for the missions that we claim we're there to do? That clearly helps Beijing. It helps sow those seeds that China hopes to leverage.
How much do you think the Asian allies of the United States were rattled by the scaling down of those South Korea military exercises and some of those other elements that you just listed?
I mean, quite a bit. I don't think there is a U.S. allied or partner capital in the region, in the wider Indo-Pacific, where that has not been the news cycle for the last week. And for it to come on the back of this kind of repeated bad news, the Colby speech, the carrier redeployment, the cancellation or scale down of exercises, now the cancellation of new exercises this year, all of it reinforces themselves, right? Any one of these things could be explained away, but it takes on a momentum now that is really seeding doubts among U.S. allies and partners.
And the overture to Kim Jong-un.
That's right. So the idea that Washington seems to be perhaps prioritizing good relations with Pyongyang over Seoul, potentially with Beijing over, say, Manila, that's not the right signal to send.
How much, Admiral, do you think the American allies and American interests in the Indo-Pacific, in terms of their deterrence capability, has been diminished by all of the munitions that have been spent in this war with Iran?
Well, ammunition allotment, the depth of your magazines is always an issue in any conflict. And so if we use anything anywhere, we're concerned, the combatant commanders are concerned about what's available. In the big picture, of whether or not we can continue to deter China. What's happened in Iran doesn't make a substantial difference, but there is an interest in how long it takes to replace those weapons, how difficult they are to replace. So how long does it take to refill your magazines? What you've lost in the conflict in Iran is the very top tier long-range standoff weapons, which we also might want available if we were to be involved in some sort of a confrontation with the Chinese, in particular over Taiwan. So there is concern about how long it's going to take to get those weapons back, because that gives you the most deterrent effect. So there's an impact here. But with all of these things that are happening, I think the U.S. still is in a strong position in the Western Pacific. I don't think we've alienated allies to the point where we can't reassure them in future outreach, future exercises, and how we reconstitute the force.
Well, oftentimes there's the political conversation, and most of what we discussed today is political, but then there's what they call the mill-to-mill, the relationships between the militaries. And so what do you think American military commanders are telling their Asian counterparts to try to comfort them amid all of this speculation about increased American disinterest?
Well, I think they point first to the national security strategy, which really tells us that we should be interested in the great power competition, in particular with China and Russia, and be prepared to deter any sort of malign activity on the part. We need allies and partners to do that. And so I think they have those sorts of discussions. Part of that is the theater security cooperation that combatant commanders like to do. So when exercises are drawn down or postponed or canceled, that creates a little bit of angst. And so I think it's a matter of looking forward to what we're going to do next. We have faced that similar criticism in the Middle East for a long time, where the partners in the Middle East thought we might be too interested in the Western Pacific and not interested enough in the Middle East. So regardless of where we go, we're going to face some of those challenges. But that really should cause us to want to increase the relationships and the strength of those relationships over time.
Were you disappointed that this could weaken the relationship with South Korea in particular, who has been such a good ally of the U.S.?
Well, they're a great ally and partner, and we ought to do what we can to reinforce their value as an ally and partner.
We just saw, Greg, Vladimir Putin, the Russian president, visit these disputed islands that Tokyo still claims. To what extent do you think, as there's all this turmoil and speculation about what the U.S. intends to maintain in the Indo-Pacific, to what extent do you think China, Russia, and North Korea are all coordinating?
There is an enormous amount of Russia-North Korea coordination, obviously, as evidenced by North Korea sending more troops and more materiel to the front in Ukraine. China and Russia have also coordinated more and more at the strategic level, and I think it took quite a while for, Washington to catch up to just how sincere Putin and Xi were to really coordinating strategically. Beijing cannot afford, or does not want to at least, see Russia lose in Ukraine, for instance. I think that triangle is going to get tighter and tighter in the years ahead. We are going to see at least those three revisionist powers moving in the same direction, and all three are going to be happy if they perceive that the U.S. is giving its allies and partners pause. Now, all of that said, I will note that with the Russians so stretched and doing so poorly in Ukraine, I'm deeply skeptical of the idea that Russia can actually shift enough assets back to the Pacific to make much of a difference for China there.
In terms of shifting assets back to the Pacific, Admiral, if and when this war winds down, what would you expect to see in terms of where these carriers are positioned? Would you want at least one, if not two, of those strike groups that you mentioned earlier to be back in the Pacific?
Sure. We want to have a carrier strike group in the Western Pacific whenever we possibly can. And it's a rare event when we take one out. I think it's been more than a decade since we've done that. So I think as soon as we're done with the George Washington, or that another carrier is sufficiently trained up and ready to go and can relieve the George Washington, we'll get her back into the Western Pacific. She's home ported in Japan, and she's an important part of the whole strategic picture there in the region.
These major wars that we've seen in the past few years, Ukraine and Iran, Admiral, how much have they changed about how we think about the need for these carriers versus other ships or other kinds of machinery?
Well, part of our ability to grow the Navy, I think, is the ability to take on some of these new technologies. So if you remember, a month and a half or so ago, a Apache crew was shot down over the water near the Strait of Hormuz. It was rescued by an unmanned. They were rescued by an unmanned vessel. We need more of those. We have a different threat than when the George Washington or any of the Nimitz-class carriers were brought into service. You know, when those ships came online, there weren't anti-ship ballistic missiles there are today. What I think we should be happy about and comfortable with is the fact that aircraft carriers are very adaptable. You know, the Nimitz was laid down it went into service in 1975, so more than 50 years ago. It is a much different ship with different aircraft and much different capabilities today as it ends its service life than it was when it first came into service. So we have that adaptability.
Completely different landscape. We've learned so much from those wars that I mentioned, and of course, on the geopolitical stage, so much is evolving. And will in the coming months, and you noted that summit with Xi next month. Greg Poling of CSIS and Vice Admiral John Miller, who ran naval forces in the Middle East. Thank you both so much for joining me. And that's all from the team here in Washington. I want to hand it back to Manny Rapolo and Al Jazeera's global headquarters in Doha.
Well, that's it for this edition of This is America. We'll be back on Tuesday. That's going to be at 18:30 GMT. That's 2:30 p.m. Eastern if you're here in the United States. From all of us here stateside, it's goodbye for now.